not scripturally based in the sense that it is not part of our common scripture of the Old Testament. So that's why I think it's important for us to take that perspective, at least my view is we take that perspective in, because it is not, although as we will read, there are an abundance of common scriptural themes. Nothing that happens in the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical canonical writings would be considered scriptural. So any miracles or anything like that that would be attributed to that cannot be given the same weight as that we find in the Old Testament, that we have, that has been approved by somebody, not me. So that, I hope people take that into account when we take this class, that this is not about debunking the power of God or disputing his omniscience or his presence, but the fact that there are things that we have discovered that just are that are shed things from a different light. For example, and I'm going to read from the book of Nehemiah this morning a little bit. We read about the introduction of the law, the reintroduction of the law to the people. And I've mentioned this before, and at least for me, and maybe I'm the only one here who grew up with the understanding or the teaching that the law was always present to all the people of the book, as they were called by outsiders. That they always understood that what the law said and what the law meant. And a clear reading of this indicates that that's not the truth. That can't be, because the people didn't understand the law. So it had to be read to them again. So for me, from that perspective, understanding that analysis, it indicates that there is something that there's part of the story that we are missing. Not that they weren't aware of it or that the people who originally wrote these weren't aware of it. But the fact of the matter is that they did not understand it at that point. So I just wanted to kind of take that into and let you guys know that perspective from this class's point of view. It is not an attempt to discredit or to dissuade anybody. As I've said before, I think these truths or this information that I personally read and uncover and slowly understand, I think it strengthens my faith in the sense that I can feel myself being a part of this, because I am full of mistakes, I'm full of I don't knows, and it makes me realize that the people who transmitted this, not God's word, but the people who actually translated it, were just like me. They made mistakes too, and they're human beings. But it doesn't mean that that this inspiration or these words are not inspired. That being said, when we read some of the apocryphal books, we're going to, at least from my point of view, why wasn't this included? Why is this excluded from the canon? Why is there 300, 400 years of no writing? And of course, we'll get to the analysis of books like Daniel, where at least historians and scholars are fairly certain that it was written in the 2nd century BCE, based on different analysis, and we'll get into that. But before we get into the class proper, are there any prayer requests other than the ones that we know? We know that Kevin is still needing our prayers, that Shane still needs our prayers. A lot of the youth are gone, the youth in action in Kansas City. so I got to take a nap yesterday without having to do any chores. So that was nice. Tom. I better write that down because I will forget Tom's name. Okay. All right. So let's bow our heads in prayer. Holy God, we come before you. Thank you for this day. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for being God, and just doing those things that you saw fit to bring us closer to you. We lift up all those that are in our hearts, Kevin and Shane, and all those who are ill and needing our prayers. We pray for Sue's friend Tom. We lift him up, that you watch over him and protect those who are, or just watch over and bless those who are caring for him and helping him out. Those who are sick, those who are not able to be with us this morning, we thank you for this beautiful weather, because we know that all seasons have a purpose that you have created, and we thank you for loving us and putting us in your creation. We turn to you, give you honor and glory. We praise your name with all the saints and the angels and the elders in heaven, and we just ask that you bless us. Help us to be mindful of the things that you've created and put in this world for us to know. We love you, and we pray this all through Christ's holy name. Amen. All right. So I am going to ask a favor moving forward. If you guys have a Bible, you guys bring a Bible to class, or, we're going to start kind of going through some of like I was trying to explain. I guess I got a little bit sidetracked. In order to understand the Apocrypha, the stuff that's missing, we got to understand, or at least know, what was written right before. Traditionally, we look at the Bible and we believe that it's in chronological order. It's obviously not, because the book of Malachi, though it was one of the last prophetic books written that we have evidence of, it wasn't actually the last book written, from what scholars and scientists and so forth can point out. But it's good to know, and that's kind of what I've been talking about, the Second Temple period, because it's important. That's where it gets left off. You can't jump into the water without being on the shore. So we got to understand what the shoreline looks like, and that's where we're at. So big picture, around the middle of the 500s BCE, Judah is allowed to come back for whatever reason. The focus of the Old Testament from that point moving on is Jerusalem. And I've said before, we don't really get to hear about the smaller provinces, the smaller cities and villages and so forth. But the focus is on Jerusalem. And we know that the temple gets rebuilt. We have archaeological evidence, and we'll talk about that during the exile, at least in Alexandria, there is a temporary temple built. It's never really, doesn't really take off or so forth, but that's the archaeological evidence that we have. There's actually some writings that have been uncovered between the temple priests in Jerusalem and the Judean or the exilic organization in Alexandria talking about the temples, I guess. So there's that information out there. There's also the presupposition that if there was at least one temple in Alexandria, there might have been a smaller temple maybe in Babylon during the exile at that point, nonetheless. So you have this post-exilic Second Temple period for about 200 years, and then in the 300s, late 300s, the Macedonians take over. Alexander, before he was called the Great, he was just Alexander. And his Um, his, does anybody know who Alexander the Great's mentor was? Socrates. If anybody's ever seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, he calls him Socrates. And ever since then, that's what I call Socrates. But yes, I'm that kind of weirdo. I'll try not to. I confuse myself all the time. Don't worry. All right. So Socrates. So all these famous names, they're all kind of interconnected. So you have Alexander who comes in, and there's actually a poem that, again, has been uncovered that describes it's the only description of Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. And I will bring that when we cover that section real quick, and we'll kind of talk about it. It's an interesting poem. He describes it as a small village. And again, given that his extensive travels, his extensive being throughout the world, for him to call Jerusalem a small village kind of says something, at least for me. But then you have the Macedonians, and they're in charge. This is really where it gets complicated and confusing, and this is actually where the post-exilic or the quiet era begins. It really is after kind of Nehemiah, so around the late 400s, or the early 400s, I guess as you would call it, around 420, 400 BCE, where it really gets quiet. Then in it's either 28 or 29, can't remember off the top of my head, Alexander the Great conquers. He doesn't conquer Jerusalem. He conquers Babylon and the Macedonian, or the Achaemenid Empire, the Persians. He kind of just skips over because, again, Yehud is just a satrapy. It's a province of Persia, and it's not the focus of his attacks. So he goes in there. When that happens, then it gets kind of distributed again into different states. You have the Assyrians, which we now call the area of Syria. Don't ask me why. I don't know yet. But so Damascus is the head of the Levant area. You have Egypt and so forth. So you have the Assyrian. So the big picture is in the 300s and the early 200s, or the late 200s, whichever. I don't know how to describe it. But like the 280s. You have this fight between the Assyrians in Damascus and the Egyptians, the Ptolemies in Alexandria in Egypt. And they're fighting over they're fighting over the land. So at first you get the Assyrians who are in charge, and then you get the Ptolemies who are in charge. But they're not fully in charge. It's kind of the Macedonians or the Assyrians are still in charge somewhat. Then they pollute the temple in Jerusalem. And that's when the Maccabees come in. You have the Maccabean revolt. They throw everybody out. And for about 100 years, Judea is independent. They haven't had independence since the 7th century BCE, since Second Temple, right before the exile. They get independent. Well, they're still having to deal with the Assyrians and the Egyptians. So who's going to be their ally? The Romans. The Romans. So around 160, either 160 or 60, because I still haven't gotten to that part of the timeline. The Judeans reach out to Rome and say, hey, help us. The Romans don't come in. They're invited. Kind of like the old horror movies where you don't invite the vampire in and then they won't come in. Well, unfortunately, the Judeans, the Maccabeans, did, because they needed help dealing with the Assyrians and the Ptolemies. Well, the Romans were cool with that for about so many years, and then they said, now you're going to be one of our provinces. You're going to be independent, but you're going to be a province. The Romans do not, so that's how you end up with Herod. Herod is the king of Judea. He is an actual king. He's not installed by the Romans. He's a puppet king supported by the Romans. Well, he dies. And then the Romans realize this isn't working out for them. Then the Romans take over. And then they start installing procurators. So at that point, there is no king in Judea. You now have in-person Roman rulers who answer directly to the Caesar. Okay? That's the history we have in a nutshell, as we understand it. The details we're going to get into. But before we do that, we're going to talk real quick about the rest of the fauna of Yehud. Okay? We're really going to kind of focus on the first 5. The equid, the donkey, and the horse, those are all a type of horse, donkey, and mule. Okay? I don't really have any slides for that, but it's important to understand that those animals are important because they are the labor carriers. The horse especially, very, very rare. Horses are expensive, they're large, they take a lot of food compared to a donkey. They don't work, they don't carry as much as a donkey can, and so forth, and an equid. The gazelle is is one of the few wild animals that we have extensive archaeological evidence about. The dog, being man's best friend for millennia, has always been there. It's important to understand all of these animals at one point or another may have been considered food, including the dog, including the wild boar, because as we've described before and we talked before, there's no Starbucks, there's no Schnucks, and when things get hard, they get hard. Okay? And then the chicken. Chicken is actually pretty common, which was surprising to me because the chicken comes from East Asia. Chickens originated in the China area, what we call modern-day China. But that's interesting because it indicates at least some prior trading that brings these animals domestically. Because again, you can spend time looking through all of these, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but all of these animals, with the exception of the gazelle, are not domestically native to the Levant. They're around the area, most of them in Mesopotamia, which is kind of, or in the Anatolia area, Turkey, and north to the Caucasus, okay, the Stans, Georgia, so forth. Throughout the millennia, these get brought in and so forth, indicating not just domestication, but trade routes and trade information. Okay? So, we're going to talk about Ovis aries. So, the sheep. Why is the sheep important? Well, we all know the sheep is important for a number of reasons, the Passover and so forth, and whatnot. But most importantly is the wool. It's a product that you can trade, and it's renewable because it happens every year. So as long as you have a decent sheep herd, you can learn about, or you can count on having some source of trade value. Because again, we're not dealing at this point in the world, a lot of this is done by barter. Okay, how much does a sheep, does a wool coat cost? Well, it costs half a sheep. So you can buy 2 coats for 1 sheep or so forth. There's no, we're getting rid of the penny. They didn't even have the penny. So, before I forget, one thing I wanted to talk about, we talked about flora. So we talked about grapes a couple weeks ago and the importance of grapes. Is anybody here like homesteading, like does home remedies or make home things? Okay. Anybody make vinegar? Homemade vinegar? Ever? Does anybody know what vinegar is? What's vinegar? What's that? Yep, it's rotten wine. It's really what it is. And I say that because I'm one of those weirdos, so I get like history things pop up on my feeds all the time. And I've known this for the longest time. One of the most common seasonings and additions to food, if you ever do any history on history of cooking in medieval ages or Roman ages, the most common flavoring added to food other than salt, because pepper was absolutely expensive, was vinegar. And why was that? Well, because you had an abundance of leftover wine that went bad. And you're not just going to throw it away. But you can't really drink it. I mean, anybody try that apple cider vinegar challenge where, it's supposed to cleanse it? I'm sure it does cleanse you out because, that's what vinegar does. But that's what it is. So remember that everything has a purpose. Nothing is thrown away. And I was reading this because I follow this thing about, if you follow Tudor history. And there's this woman, a historian, she talks about all the things about Tudor history. And she's got this podcast that was talking about the seasonals. And it's related to sheep. Sheep are only eaten in the spring. And why is that? Because they've already reproduced. And in late winter is generally when you shear the sheep. You shear the sheep in late winter in preparation for the spring where they can start growing again.
I thought you said winter.
Right. And that's why sheep are commonly eaten in the spring. So Easter, not here in the U.S., but throughout most of the rest of the world, the common Easter meal is sheep or mutton. Nope, not mutton. This is what I learned. So you eat sheep, and you can shear sheep twice a year, in the late fall and the early spring. And you eat sheep. You eat the young sheep in spring, and then you let them grow, and you shear them again. And now they're older. And what is mutton? Old sheep. So that's when you eat the mutton. You eat the mutton in the spring, or in the fall. During the summer months, you eat birds and fish. Even cheese was seasonal because you didn't get milk. There wasn't a 24-hour process of milk. You had the milk. It was milked in calf. You didn't intentionally breed your cows all the time so that you could continue to have this milk, or with goats, as we'll talk about. So everything is seasonal. Even bread is seasonal to some extent, which is how you end up with fermentation. You have the fermentation of, in the colder climates, of the wheat and the barley. So you have what we talked about, near beer, which is what everyone drank for the longest time, or you have wine in the warmer climates. So everything is seasonal, including sheep. So scientifically, historically, archaeologically, that provides those people a basis for understanding why sheep were important, especially in the spring, to the people of the Levant. So, sheep in the coastal areas of the Levant, Phoenicia, might have been bred for wool, showing trade in livestock, possibly introducing new sheep types. Animal bone remains from sites like Yehud show that sheep and goat, alongside cattle and pigs, were common in ancient Near Eastern diets and economies. And again, it's easy to think this whole area is just Judea or Judah or Yehud. It's not. It's Phoenicia, Assyria, Samaria. It's all these people. So, as we talked about briefly last week, pigs are very common in the area. Wild boar are common. And we've got some information on that as well. So we don't live in a vacuum. These people integrate on a regular basis. They not even, that's part of Nehemiah. That's part of Ezra. If you study Ezra and Nehemiah, there is the chastisement of the Jews for intermarrying. That's a huge portion of Ezra. It is the condemnation of the people who remained in Yehud, who were intermarrying, intermingling with the non-Jews. And there is a prohibition that wasn't necessarily in place prior to the return because they had become so diluted. So, sheep. Key themes: sacrifice, obviously. Sheep and lambs were central to Old Testament sacrifices and offerings, which symbolized atonement. Example, Exodus 29:39. All throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, we have God as the shepherd and Jesus as the good shepherd. Common metaphor, and these are all Old Testament references. So we're not even getting into the New Testament periods at this point. Ezekiel and Psalms talk about how God is the one who guides and protects and gathers his people. And his people are the sheep, and he is the shepherd. The Israel sheep. The Israelites are frequently called the sheep of his pasture, often straying or needing rescue. How often does God say, I'm done with you? And then somebody comes to God and says, Lord, forgive them. And his heart softens and he says, you are my people. So, they're lost sheep. Parables and prophecies, lost sheep, symbolizing individuals who wander from God, and need to be sought out. Ezekiel, we talk about some of the minor prophets. Hosea, talking about his wife and her being stranded and lost, but yet God wants you to deal with them because you're going to have to live with them. David, obviously the great shepherd, not the good shepherd, the great shepherd. He's the shepherd king. In Psalms, figurative language, the sheep represent innocence, gentleness, and vulnerability. Shepherd signifies leadership and care. We're going to talk about the goat next, and you're going to understand. I think there's a scientific, or at least a animal husbandry basis for the differences between sheep and goats. We'll talk about that in a second. Specific examples: Genesis 4, Isaiah 53, Ezekiel 34, and Psalm 23 I have listed if anybody wants to write those down.
And you do highlight it there when you say it signifies leadership care. In other words, they needed leadership care. The sheep. They are the dumbest animal I think ever created. They would follow anything or anybody, and they always had to have a leader.
Right.
And that's one of the best examples. The figurative language it represents sheep as somebody that needs a leader, and that is in through Christ Jesus the shepherd.
And the funny thing is next slide, please. The funny thing is, goats are not that way.
Right.
Goats don't need a leader. They are a very intelligent animal. Sheep and goats are closely related, both from the subfamily. They are a separate species, very rare hybrids, always infertile. A hybrid of a ewe and a buck is called a sheep-goat hybrid. There's actually no scientific name for it because it's just a rare occurrence. They are always infertile, as far as we understand it. Goats look different. We all know what a goat looks like compared to a sheep. Sheep is nice and woolly and pretty and docile. Goats look like, somebody ran over their toe. you know, the males have a beard. They got the eye with the slit that looks sideways or up and down. I'm trying to remember my time at Grant's farm, the last time I saw a goat. So beards, a divided upper lip of sheep. Sheep's tails hang down, while the short tails of goats are upward. Sheep breeds are often naturally polled, either in both sexes or just in the female. And polled means that they're born, that you either get born all females or all males. And while naturally polled goats are rare, though many are polled artificially. Males of the two species differ in that, and this is very important, buck goats acquire a unique and strong odor during the rut, whereas rams do not. Rams are male sheep. So, for the longest time when I was a kid, I thought a goat was just a male sheep, but it's not. A ram is male sheep. A male goat is called a male goat. I'm sure there's a name for it, I just don't know what it is off the top of my head, and I didn't write it down. The odor, the demeanor, the way that goats act, and how they are different than a sheep are the biological differences. But it also is, it's understandable in the sense that if you raise goats, and you're living in 4th century BCE Levant, you smell like a goat. You're already going to smell like a goat as it is. Because again, ritual washing is water. There's no soft soap. They don't get to go to Walmart and buy the antibacterial soap. There's water. But that's about it. Water can only take out so much of the smell. You're going to smell like a goat. Because goats naturally have an odor, whereas sheep do not, lends to the historical scientific analysis that they are off-putting. They are not the nice, important animal of the two. Now, other differences in goats. Goats generally will eat almost anything. Sheep, on the other hand, will not. Sheep are grass eaters, period. Goats are vegetation killers. If you don't want, honeysuckle in your house, borrow a couple of goats. Honeysuckle will be gone. Because very much like pigs, goats will root down and pull the roots out. As opposed to and sheep will too, but sheep are only primarily interested in grass, which is kind of why we had the issue in the 1800s between the sheep herders and the cattle farmers out in the West. All right, so what is the importance of the goat? Well, a goat is still a sacrificial and an important animal in the Old Testament. Okay, so in Leviticus 16, it's talking about the Day of Atonement. The most famous reference detailing 2 goats, one sacrificed to the Lord, and the other left out to go to the wilderness. The scapegoat. Literally, that's where it comes from. So, it's important. A goat is also sacrificed to the Lord because anything that's important, and I'm sure you all, before I came to this church, you all had tons of lessons on first fruits and what you give to the Lord. That the Old Testament said that you give the most important thing, you give the first fruits to the Lord upon harvest. Well, if you're a goat herder, you don't have sheep, or you may not have sheep. So you're going to give your best, which is going to be, in your case, a goat. So it's still a sacrificial animal, but in the hierarchy of animals, plays second fiddle to the sheep for a number of reasons. Genesis 15:9, Abraham offers a she-goat as part of the covenant ceremony. And then there's various verses in Leviticus and Numbers that mention goats for sin offerings, burnt offerings, and peace offerings. So, historical and practical uses: milk and food. Very much like sheep and all the rest of the animals that we've talked about, you're going to use it for what you can before you kill it. Because you can make more with milk than you can with can with meat. Meat will go bad. Milk will go bad too, but you can do cheese. You can make cheese and yogurt and so forth. So, and if anybody has ever been to the Middle East, the Levant area, you will know how important yogurt and milk products are to them. They eat it everywhere. They drink it they drink yogurt. It's not milk. It's yogurt that they drink all the time. And then clothing. Most importantly, the curtains of the tabernacle are made of goat's hair. So, for God to include that as part of his tabernacle. And again, we've talked about this before. The tabernacle is different than the first temple. The first temple is different than the second temple. The tabernacle was the house of the ark in the wilderness and during their travels. And even when they first settled into Israel, into the Levant, it was still their primary worship locale in Bethel. It was a tent. They didn't have a solid building for millennia, for hundreds of years. So, for God to say, I want goat's hair in my tabernacle, demonstrates the importance of the goat in the environment and in the community, in the people themselves. So, and that's found in Exodus 26, 6 through 8. Symbolism, you get sin and rebellion. Goats, again, because they are not sheep, they're the opposite of sheep. In the New Testament, the goat is considered more of the opposition. In the leaders, in Isaiah 14:9, Zechariah 10:3, you get a he-goat, in Hebrew the atud, which symbolizes leaders or princes. How we get from Isaiah and Zechariah to the imagery in Matthew, not sure. I don't know. Probably we'll get to some of that understanding as we progress through the class. And then wild goats are mentioned throughout the Old Testament, where David hid in 1 Samuel. The cattle, the bos taurus, the largest of the land animals that are mentioned, not the largest, the largest of the sacrificial animals presented in the Old Testament. So, we talked about this briefly just a few minutes ago, that many of these animals are not native to the Levant area itself. This is one of those. There's extensive archaeological history about cattle. The cattle that were common in the Middle East and in the Levant area at this time come from Anatolia, which is Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and that's kind of where the domestication occurred. So, around the 9th or 8th millennia BCE, so we're talking 9,000 to 8,000 BCE, in the northern Levant Euphrates region, and spreading further south, you start to see management and size reduction of these domesticated animals. The more modern of these cattle come from crossbreeding from the Iron Age. They are crossbred with another form of cattle called Bos indicus, the zebu, which is a cow that was originally or cattle that was originally found in India. So they bred them for whatever reason, and at that point, you get what is considered the more common Middle Eastern cattle. You'll notice that even though they look similar, these are different than the common cattle we see in the U.S., the various breeds. I did have a couple of slides about the differences. I figured that was just going to be a little too much, so. But temperament-wise, they're all generally the same. You know, it's my understanding that they taste the same and so forth, but their purpose was wholly different. The ox and the cattle were primary, as we talked about, sheep for their wool, goats for their milk. Cattle were working animals, primarily. They were not primarily, as I learned, not primarily used for milk, because breeding cows was a dangerous thing in the late, before the Common Era. You didn't want to mess with a bull when they were probably less domesticated than what we have now. That being said, the bull and the ox and the cattle are important in the Old Testament, as we see. What they symbolize, strength, prosperity, and sacrifice, because again, they're expensive. They're the largest of the animals that are commonly domesticated and bred. They represent power because they're strong, they're used in agriculture, and they are linked to divine power, metaphors for enemies that are considered strong, such as in Psalm 22:12, the golden calf, again, a large animal. So, strength and power, in Deuteronomy 33:17, Joseph is blessed with majesty and horns of a wild ox, his power to gore the peoples. The strong bulls of Bashan. In Ezekiel, the fattened animals of Bashan for sacrificial feast. In Isaiah 34:7. But we also know that in Exodus and Deuteronomy, the sacrifice of the bull is the largest of the sacrifices. So, sacrifice bulls were required for various burnt offerings, purification, dedication, and atonement, such as in Leviticus 1:3-5. God questions the need for physical sacrifices, stating, "Will I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" in Psalm 50. And then, again, the golden calf showing idolatry. God's voice is considered mighty like a bull's, shaking the wilderness. The great bronze sea in the first temple rested on 12 bronze bulls, symbolizing God's life-giving power. Cherubim, Ezekiel describes cherubim with bulls' faces guarding God's throne, and the bull of Jacob in Genesis and Isaiah. And then animal welfare, talking about how animals are domesticated and controlled. Do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, because if you muzzle an ox, it's not going to want to move. It wants to eat while it's working, which makes sense. Our favorite, the wild boar. It's native to the Levant with the subspecies Suscrofa libicus, the Anatolian Levantine boar. Being prominent, thriving in diverse habitats like forests and wetlands, historically significant as an ancestor to domestic pigs, with their presence in management documented from ancient times to modern conflicts, human settlements. They are omnivorous, so that's a problem. You don't want them eating other animals and your grains, or your agriculture. They're nocturnal, so they're working while you're not. Again, can't guard against them. It's very hard to do so. And the rooting behavior is a key indicator of their presence, leading to crop damage and urban incursions, especially in areas like Israel and Palestine. Okay. So again, thinking about it from a non-biblical source, that's a problem. If they eat everything, you can't control them, and they're doing these things while you're asleep, you don't want them in your midst. Possibly an archaeological reference to why pigs are not liked, other than a number of other reasons. And anybody who's ever dealt with wild boar used to go hunting down South Texas once a year. Wild boar, it's pretty much free because they want to get rid of them because they have a super bad problem down there.
Question.
Yes, sir.
The omnivorous,
Yes.
does that eat everything?
Eats everything.
Okay.
Animals and plants. As opposed to sheep and goats and cattle that only eat animals or plants. All right, we'll kind of cover this real quick, and then next week we're going to kind of start talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and the return, and then we'll start getting into the history of the Levat and Judah, Yehud, in the 4th and early 5th centuries BCE, so that we can get ready to start talking about the Apocrypha. Any questions? Thank you for your time.